and that's not saying much more than science posed a fatal challenge to religion. But it's saying it in a much more profound and interesting way. And it also explains why he makes this claim, that nihilism is the logical conclusion of the great values and ideals. So he didn't think about nihilism as a counter proposition, say, to dogmatic Christianity. He thought about it as the logical outcome of that. So now you think, well, is that relevant? Why is that relevant? Well, I think it's relevant for a lot of ideas, for a lot of reasons. The first question is, or the first observation might be that a tremendous amount of mental illness, and this is an existential claim, is grounded in nihilism. When someone who's depressed comes to see you, what they often say is, I can't see any point in life. And that isn't what they mean. What they mean is, they see the meaning of life as suffering, which is a meaning, right? And that's not bearable. And then the question is, given that, why bother with it? And that's the fundamental question of suicide. And it's a philosophical question. I think it was Camus who said that the only real philosophical question was whether or not to commit suicide. Now, that's a little dark. I mean, maybe old Camus could have used some SSRIs, but you get the point. And it's inappropriate, in my estimation, to even discuss something, even to discuss depression with someone who's depressed, especially if they're intelligent and open, and therefore more tilted towards philosophical wonderings, without actually addressing the issue. Why live in the face of suffering? Okay, so that's one problem. It's to the degree that you will find it difficult in your life to build anything solid under your feet that you can stand on and believe, have faith in, let's say, you're going to be adrift. And the reason for that is, a lot of the things you're going to have to do will be difficult and they'll involve suffering, which is also an existential claim. So the existentialists, for example, they don't make the same claim Freud does. Freud claims that, in some sense, that the normal person is mentally healthy, apart from the mild distress of normal life. And then in order to be psychopathological, you have to have been hurt. And maybe multiple times, and there's other things that could contribute to that, but the existentialists would say, no, let's just wait a minute here. Maybe the fundamental condition of human beings is nihilism and suffering, and that something has to be produced to counter that in order for life to be tolerable. Well, I think that's a perfectly reasonable proposition. Now, it's a strange proposition, because I've seen, in my lifetime, I've seen people who are tormented by existential ideas, who can't get them out of their mind, ideas that relate to the meaning of life, and then other people, and concern about death, for example, and the extinguishing of everything that seems to have any value. It's a primary concern with them. And then I've seen other people for whom those questions never seem to arise. Now, I think those people are, first of all, I think they're conservative people. I don't think they're very open, and I think they're probably rather low in neuroticism. So they're not philosophically curious. They don't go up chains of abstractions. And even if they do, they don't necessarily get disturbed in the most profound areas of their being by the questioning. But that still leaves plenty of people in the other category. Now, the nihilism, well, nihilism and atheism are closely related. I don't think they're identical by any stretch of the imagination. Although I think it's difficult for atheism to describe why it's not essentially nihilistic. And that's Dostoyevsky's big criticism, because Dostoyevsky's claim was that without any fundamental value assumed, then there's no reason why you can't do anything you want. And that's his famous line, if there's no God, then everything is permitted. And all of Dostoyevsky's novel writing is an exploration of that idea. And sometimes it's an exploration of what that idea might mean if it was acted out in the life of a given individual, and so that would be, say, Crime and Punishment. And another would be, say, in his book, The Devils or the Possessed, it's an examination of what that idea means if it's gripped by an individual who has social and political ambitions. And that's when Dostoyevsky basically prophesied, so to speak, that one of the consequences of the death of God would be the rise, basically, of communist totalitarianism, because essentially that's what he predicted in The Devils. So, That's a pretty dead-on accurate prediction. It was really quite stunning to me when I came across it. And Nietzsche made exactly the same prediction, by the way. And so, for those two men, the death of an ultimate meaning system, especially one that, you see, when you think about something like European Christianity, it's misleading in some sense, because the system of beliefs that constituted European Christianity and other great belief systems wasn't 2,000 years old. It was like 25,000 years old. You know, you can think about it as beginning at year zero, but it's a mistake from a historical perspective. The ideas that profound religious traditions are predicated on are generally grounded in ideas that are much, much older than the traditions themselves. And so, in some sense, when at the end of the 19th century, when things fell apart for us and we could no longer rely on our history-predicated morality to guide us, it wasn't merely that we lost an overlay, a psychological overlay that had been laid on humanity for 2,000 years. It was way deeper than that. We don't even know how old those ideas are. We have some idea about how old they are. They're at least as old as written culture. But we also know that the people who have been brought into the mainstreams of history, you know, as the world has united, the people who were not literate had mythologies that drew from the same themes. And some of those people, as far as we can tell, had lived a lifestyle that was essentially unchanged for 25,000 years. And so the Australian Aborigines are like that. So there's plenty of evidence that these ideas are extraordinarily old, and what that means is that when we separate from them, in some sense, not only do we separate from our philosophical presuppositions, but we separate from the historical consequences of our biology. It's a serious problem, and I think that's partly why it's very difficult to distinguish between someone who's nihilistic and someone who's mentally ill. That's not a radical claim. I mean, people, especially who are on the depressed side of the distribution, will tell you that they're nihilistic. You know, they may not use that terminology, although they often do. I just can't see any point. It's like, well, why does that matter? Why does it matter? It seems to be a fact that it matters. So it's an interesting fact. That's a phenomenological fact in some sense, because one of the things that Heidegger pointed out, and he was a founder of the phenomenological school, was that your primary orientation to the world, he thinks in a strange way, that your primary orientation to the world was one of care. So you could say, well, what characterizes your experience? What sort of creature are you? And Heidegger's answer would be, well, you're a creature who cares about things. Insofar as you're engaged in the world, your primary orientation is one of care. And you can think about that as a value, right? It's a consequence of your value orientation, and God only knows where that comes from. Part of it's biological, part of it's developmental, part of it's historical. It's very, very complex. But if you stop caring about everything, you're in trouble. And that's one of the things that seems to indicate that caring is actually a fundamental reality. You stop caring about things, you don't stop suffering. And it seems that unless the caring counterbalances the suffering, you can't maintain an even keel. And that's partly because it doesn't seem just, right? I mean, when terrible things happen to people, they always say, well, two things. How is it that being could be constituted in this manner? Like, what the hell's going on at the fundamental levels of reality that such suffering has to be the case? You'll certainly ask that if you have a child who's diagnosed with cancer, for example. Or you might think, well, why is this cruelty, as it appears, necessarily aimed at me right now in this place, when hypothetically it could have not happened at all, or perhaps been visited on someone more deserving, you know, which is the good are punished and the evil remain unpunished, something like that. So that produces, for human beings, that produces a cry it's a cry for justice. How can the world be constituted that way? And that seems to be built into us. Those aren't questions we can just avoid. They're questions that will arise in your psyche. They'll arise as fundamental questions when sufficiently terrible things happen to you. So the existentialists would say, well, those are conditions of existence. You're just stuck with that. It's part of human nature. It's part of human being to be perplexed by those questions. Then the question is, at least in part, is there any way of answering them?